June 28, 1914, Sarajevo shimmered beneath the summer sun, its narrow streets crowded with onlookers eager to catch a glimpse of imperial royalty. Open-topped automobiles rolled slowly through the city as Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, toured the annexed province of Bosnia alongside his wife Sophie. Flags fluttered, military officers stood rigid. It felt ceremonial, almost routine, and yet, hidden among the crowd was a 19-year-old nationalist whose resolve would detonate the century. Within minutes, gunshots would echo across Europe, and nothing would ever be the same. The assassin was Gavrilo Princip, a member of a secret revolutionary network determined to end Austro-Hungarian control over Slavic lands. Bosnia had been formally annexed by Austria-Hungary in 1908, enraging neighboring Serbia and inflaming Slavic nationalism across the Balkans. Two young radicals like Princip, the Archduke represented imperial domination. Earlier that morning, another conspirator had thrown a bomb at the Archduke's motorcade and failed. The royal couple continued their visit. Fate, however, had not finished its work. A wrong turn by the Archduke's driver brought the car to a halt near the Latin Bridge. By sheer coincidence, Princip was standing just yards away. He stepped forward, he raised his pistol, 2 shots rang out. Sophie was struck first, then the Archduke. Within minutes, both were dead. Princip did not run, he was seized immediately. But the true shockwave had only begun. In Vienna, outrage hardened into resolve. The assassination was not treated as an isolated act of terrorism. It was framed as a direct assault by Serbia itself. Austria-Hungary drafted an ultimatum, a list of demands so severe that no sovereign nation could accept them entirely. Serbia was given 48 hours, comply or face war. Behind closed doors, leaders calculated risks, unaware that the machinery of alliances was already grinding into motion. Serbia conceded most demands, but refused those that compromised its sovereignty. It was not enough. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war. Artillery thundered along the Danube. A regional dispute had become a military confrontation. But Europe was not a collection of isolated states. It was a web of binding promises, rival ambitions, and military timetables ticking toward catastrophe. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany pledged support to Austria-Hungary. France stood by Russia. Britain watched the balance of power tremble. What leaders believed would be a limited conflict was spiraling beyond control. Within weeks, the continent would be engulfed in flames. And as armies mobilized across Europe, few realized they were stepping into a war that would erase empires, redraw maps, and shape the modern world. If you're drawn to stories that reveal how single moments can transform history, consider subscribing and liking the video. It helps more people discover these deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Because the shots in Sarajevo were not the end of something. They were the beginning, and Europe was already marching toward disaster. By the summer of 1914, Europe was no peaceful mosaic of nations. It was a continent divided into armed camps. On one side stood the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other stood the Triple Entente, Russia, France, and Britain. Treaties bound them, military plans synchronized them. Suspicion fueled them. When Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia, these alliances did not hesitate. They activated, one by one, like dominoes falling in perfect, terrifying sequence. And once the first pieces tipped, there would be no stopping the collapse. German generals had long prepared for this exact nightmare, a two-front war. Their solution was the Schlieffen Plan, a bold strategy to strike France swiftly in the west before turning east against Russia. But France had heavily fortified its border with Germany. So Berlin made a fateful decision. Instead of attacking head-on, German forces would sweep through neutral Belgium, bypassing French defenses entirely. It was a military gamble and a political catastrophe waiting to unfold. Belgium refused passage. It was a small nation, but its neutrality had been guaranteed by treaty, including by Britain. Germany invaded anyway. On August 4, 1914, British leaders made their decision. Bound by obligation and determined to prevent German domination of the continent, Britain declared war. What had begun as a Balkan dispute was now a continental inferno. Within days, Europe's great powers were fully mobilized. Trains packed with soldiers rolled toward borders. Crowds cheered departing troops, many convinced they would be home by Christmas. Newspapers framed the conflict as righteous and necessary. Yet beneath the patriotic fervor lay a grim truth. Industrialized nations were about to unleash mechanized slaughter on a scale the world had never witnessed. The German advance was swift and brutal. Columns of troops marched across Belgium, clashing with resistance and sending refugees flooding westward. By late summer, German forces were approaching Paris itself. French and British troops scrambled to regroup along the Marne River. If Paris fell, France might collapse within weeks. The war could end almost as quickly as it had begun. But at the First Battle of the Marne, Allied forces halted the German push. Exhausted soldiers dug into the earth, carving out defensive lines that stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Trenches deepened, barbed wire spread like metallic thorns across the landscape. Machine guns and artillery turned open fields into killing grounds. The war of movement froze into a war of attrition, and still the conflict widened. Colonial troops were summoned, naval blockades tightened. Empires prepared for a struggle not of weeks, but of years. The alliance system that promised security had instead guaranteed catastrophe. The question was no longer whether Europe would burn, it was how far the flames would spread. As 1914 bled into 1915, what began as a European conflict began to ripple across the globe. The British Empire, leveraging its vast colonial holdings, called upon soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, and Africa. Over 1.3 million Indian soldiers alone were dispatched to the Western Front and the Middle East. These troops, fighting far from home, were caught in mud, machine gun fire, and artillery barrages, their courage often overlooked in history's grand narratives. Meanwhile, the war at sea grew just as deadly. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, targeting Allied supply lines. And then came the moment that would draw a reluctant superpower into the vortex. In 1915, a German submarine torpedoed the passenger liner Lusitania, killing 1,198 civilians, including 128 Americans. The attack inflamed public opinion across the Atlantic. Germany apologized, claiming the ship carried munitions, which it did, but the outrage had taken root. For the United States, previously committed to neutrality, the moral question became unavoidable. How long could it stand aside as Europe tore itself apart? The world was watching, and yet, even as debates raged in Congress, the tide of war surged forward relentlessly. On the Western Front, German forces advanced relentlessly, inching closer to Paris. Trenches and no man's land had replaced sweeping cavalry charges. The war was now a battle of attrition, millions of men locked in static, bloody stalemates. Artillery shells turned the horizon into haze. Machine guns cut down anyone attempting to move across open fields. Morale ebbed and flowed with each minor advance. Allied and Central powers alike struggled to replenish the unimaginable losses, knowing that the side which faltered first might face total defeat. But elsewhere, a different kind of collapse was brewing. Russia, vast and diverse, was cracking under the strain of war. Food shortages, economic disarray, and staggering casualties eroded public faith in the Tsarist regime. By 1917, the February Revolution had toppled Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia. Only months later, in October, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, promising peace, land, and bread. Russia exited the war through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, leaving Germany free to concentrate its forces in the West. For Berlin, this should have been a moment of triumph. Yet the exhaustion of men, of resources, of society itself, was becoming unbearable. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States prepared to join the fray. American troops, fresh and motivated, crossed the ocean in 1917 and 1918, reinforcing Allied lines at a crucial moment. Their arrival tilted the balance of power, halting German advances that had come frighteningly close to French cities. The war that began as a Balkan dispute was now a true world conflict, drawing in distant nations, colonies, and populations far removed from Sarajevo's fateful streets. The machinery of war churned relentlessly. Shells, bullets, and gas decimated the landscape. Yet behind the front lines, governments and citizens alike realized that the old world was ending. Empires that had ruled for centuries were teetering. And in the shadows of victory and defeat, the seeds of future conflict were already being sown. Among the survivors of the German army, a man wounded but spared, Adolf Hitler, would rise years later, shaping history once more in ways Europe could scarcely imagine. If you've been captivated by this journey through history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Your support helps more people uncover the stories that shaped our modern world. Because as the smoke cleared from Europe, it became painfully clear the war was far from over. The world had been changed forever. November 11, 1918, at the 11th hour, the guns fell silent. Germany surrendered, ending for years of unprecedented carnage. From July 28, 1914, to this moment, the war had consumed empires, claimed millions of lives, and shattered the familiar order of Europe. Streets that once carried parades of triumph now bore the weight of mourning. Soldiers returned home to destroyed villages, famine, and grief. And yet, in the midst of victory and defeat, new dangers emerged, unseen but imminent. The collapse was seismic. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, had been dethroned. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany abdicated and fled. Austria-Hungary, a centuries-old empire, dissolved into a patchwork of new nations. The Ottoman Empire, which had dominated the Middle East for centuries, was carved apart. Modern Turkey would arise from its remnants, while other territories were divided under foreign mandates. Borders were redrawn almost overnight, creating fragile nations where ethnic and political tensions simmered. Millions of refugees fled, economies spiraled into hyperinflation, and societies struggled to absorb the psychological scars of industrialized slaughter. Yet the consequences reached far beyond Europe. The United States, once hesitant to involve itself in European affairs, emerged as a global power. Its industrial and military capacity had been tested and proven, establishing it as a dominant force on the world stage. Meanwhile, Germany, humiliated and economically crippled, faced resentment, social unrest, and political upheaval. Among the survivors was a young Adolf Hitler, a soldier embittered by defeat, whose path would eventually lead to another catastrophic conflict. The war also transformed everyday life. Birth rates plummeted. Families mourned lost children, brothers, and husbands. Women, who had stepped into factories and offices during the war, began to demand rights and recognition. Technology that had been designed to kill, tanks, aircraft, chemical weapons, would leave a lasting imprint on both warfare and society. Education, politics, and economics were all altered by the brutality and scope of the conflict. The world that emerged was unrecognizable to those who had known it in 1914. Despite the armistice, the seeds of future conflict were already planted. The punitive conditions of the Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany. Nationalism, militarism, and resentment festered. The collapse of empires created power vacuums that would destabilize regions for decades. And for many, the horror of the war was both an ending and a warning. Humanity had glimpsed the destructive potential of modern warfare, and few lessons were truly learned. Looking back, the First World War was never simply about the assassination of a single archduke. It was the inevitable result of decades of political tension, imperial ambition, and military preparation. A bullet in Sarajevo had ignited the fuse, but the dynamite had been long in place. Europe's great powers had built a house of cards, and 1914 merely toppled it. In the aftermath, as empires fell and societies transformed, the modern world was born, Scarred, cautious, but undeniably changed. History often asks us to look closely at moments like these to understand how small actions ripple outward and reshape entire continents. The First World War did not just end empires. It laid the foundations for the global order we know today, a world where the echoes of Sarajevo still reverberate in politics, borders, and collective memory. And as we remember this war, we must remember, too, the cost of ambition, alliance, and nationalism is never measured solely in maps or treaties, but in human lives, lost and altered forever.